Good evening, Imad.
Good evening, Frank. Good to see you again.
Same. I was going to say we're waiting for Professor Chomsky to join us, which is obviously an honor for both of us. So your name is Imad Al-Sous. You are from Gaza. You're a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And your field of research strongly focuses on Hamas. And we spoke about 10 days ago. We had an interview. I'll share the link, by the way, again. On Hamas and on, in a way, talking about the facts. What's Hamas? What's behind the ideology of Hamas? And at the end of the conversation, I mentioned that I worked on a book with Noam Chomsky, and you told me sort of a quick story on why you'd love to actually talk to Noam Chomsky. So can you tell us again what was the story in a way?
Yeah, because my academic journey is always Chomsky's there, and he's inspiring me. I remember in my BA, I did it in English language and literature in Birzeit University in Ramallah. And I remember Chomsky was an important philosopher of language. And I used his generative approach to examine first language acquisition for my graduate seminar from the university. But also, when I went to my master's to study international relations, he also inspired me as a critical of theory of international relations. And I remember he said, it's easier to understand international relations if you read about mafia theories rather than this international relations. But also what's important about Professor Chomsky as a philosopher and as an academic, how he wants to materialize his knowledge in order to be in favor of the oppressed and the have-nots. And this linkage between the oppressed and academia inspired me. Like, for example, in the past, the suffering of the Jewish people, and in the present, in the last 73 years of the Palestinians. And this is why Chomsky has been inspiring people like me and millions around the world.
Oh, he's here. Fantastic.
Oh, super.
Professor Chomsky.
Hello, Professor Chomsky.
How are you?
We're good.
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay.
And we're very happy to obviously talk to you again. And it's and thanks again for having sort of taking the time to do this.
Very glad to be with you.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't use the right computer because it's not working, but this will manage, I guess.
Yeah, it's nice. It's great. The picture is nice. The sound is great. So let's start, right?
Okay.
Okay. So, hello, Professor Chomsky. Hello, Imad. We just had a quick introduction for Imad. Professor Chomsky, I wanted to start with you about the recent Gaza war. There's been a ceasefire for now, mediated by Egypt and between Israel and Hamas. So what's next for you now for Palestine and for Hamas and for Gaza, sorry?
Well, there are fundamental problems. The basic problem is that for 50 years, Israel has been pursuing a very specific policy. It's in the West Bank, it means constructing a greater Israel in which, without going into the details, Israel basically takes over whatever it wants and avoids the concentrations of Palestinian population. So that's in order to avoid what Israel calls the demographic problem, the problem of having too many non-Jews in what they like to call a democratic Jewish state, an oxymoron that's harder to mouth every year. So the idea will be they don't want to take over Nablus or other population concentrations, just anything that's of value. With regard to Gaza, in 2005, the Israeli government made the decision that to try to maintain settlers illegally in Gaza, was just too expensive for them. They had a large part of the IDF, the Israeli army, defending them from the people they were violently oppressing. So they withdrew the settlers, but maintained the occupation. Since then, immediately there was an election, January 2006, free election, closely monitored, declared free and fair, came out the wrong way, did not the way the US and Israel wanted it. Hamas won the election. Israel immediately broke the relation. There had been an agreement with Hamas with the Palestinians about the occupation, but Israel immediately broke it and said, no, we're giving up on all the things we promised. You voted the wrong way. Increased sanctions, increased violence. The US immediately launched an operation to try to overturn the government by military force. And a year later, Hamas preempted the effort that led to a very sharp increase in US and Israeli attacks on Gaza. Bad enough to vote the wrong way in an election, but even worse to preempt an effort to overthrow the government by military force. And since then, Gaza has been a horror story. It's a prison, 2 million people imprisoned, harsh sanctions, constant military attacks. It's kind of a punching bag for the IDF, and barely survivable. There is barely even water to drink. The sewage and power plants have been devastated by Israeli attacks. It's just bare survival and constant attacks. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, Israel pursues the Greater Israel Project. As long as this continues, as long as the West tolerates that, we're going to have repeated atrocities and crimes. So the first step that has to be taken is for the West to make it very clear and explicit that they will not tolerate these policies in any way. It will break any relation with any Israeli entity, including the government that sponsors the occupation. And that can be done with cancellation of trade, with cancellation of other relations, with boycott of multinationals that are working on the occupation and so on. That'll at least open the door to a possibility to look for possible solutions. But as long as the Greater Israel option is available, nothing's going to happen.
Thanks, Professor. Imad, do you want to quickly react on what Professor Chomsky just said?
I agree with Professor Chomsky. I think not only this current government by Netanyahu, but all the Israeli governments, they wanted to continue with their settler colonial approach at the expense of the Palestinians and denying their rights. And this is what, for example, the Israeli government in the last 5-6 years is doing, is trying to isolate the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian questions and denying their rights. But this latest event in Gaza, I think they didn't come in favor of Israel in two things. First, it united all the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in West Jerusalem, and inside Israel and in the diaspora as one people who are suffering from settler colonialism since 73 years. This unification, Israel has always tried to isolate Palestinians geographically into small communities and not linking to each other. But also the latest event, they were able to link between Gaza and Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank, Gaza and the Palestinian citizen Israel who suffer and living as a second or third or 10th citizen, and also the Palestinian in the diaspora. This new narrative, this is a new framework, I think not only will put the Palestinian question again on the table and will stop the Israeli narrative from isolating the Palestinian cause, But also, I think there is a hope now among the Palestinians to create a new framework where all the Palestinian disagreements can be discussed within this framework, and then it channeled as one strategy to confront the Israeli settler colonialism. I think this is maybe one of the most important factors regarding this latest event between Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Palestine inside Israel, against the settler colonialism of the state of Israel.
Thanks, Imad. Noam, I wanted to ask you something about the US. We've seen a change, at least in the Democratic Party, for the first time in decades. There are some strong dissenting voices inside the Democratic Party in the US when it comes to ending US or the US blind support for Israel. What do you make of this? And do you think that in the long term, it could actually change US foreign policy?
First of all, what you're seeing is Congress is a reflection of large-scale changes that are taking place among the general population. So you go back 10 or 20 years, Israel was the darling of liberal American opinion, Jewish, non-Jewish, mainstream liberal. That's changed radically. By now, among people who identify themselves as liberals, more or less, there's more support for Palestinian rights than for Israel. Support for Israel has shifted to the far right, to evangelicals and ultra-nationalists, military, the militaristic, nationalistic wing of the Republican Party. It's a big shift. It's happening among the Jewish population as well. You can read this morning's newspapers and the Israeli newspapers. Haaretz, happened to be a couple of articles about, from various points of view, about the fact that young Jews are drifting away from commitment to Israel, which is quite true. And it's in fact even true of the evangelical community. Recent polls of evangelicals have shown that the younger ones are no longer so totally wedded to extreme support of Israel as the general community had been. So this is a long-term process. It's been partly caused by Israeli actions. I couldn't see it very clearly if, in giving talks on these topics for 60 years. Until pretty recently, I used to have police protection, even at my own university. After the last couple of Gaza attacks, that totally changed. Cast lead was 2006, made a big difference. The mood just changed entirely. And its other developments have contributed to it. So the Black Lives Matter organizing, which has been going on for years and has changed the background considerably, laid the basis for the explosion that took place after the Floyd murder. That's affected other things as well. The general growing concern for issues of rights, repression, genocide, violence, and so on. All of that's been spreading among large parts of the population, and it's showing up in the attitudes towards Israel. So after this latest atrocity, for the first time, you saw, not just in Congress, but even in the mainstream press, major columnists saying, we have to stop military aid to Israel. That was unthinkable a few years ago. It's something that's now beginning. And I think the party leadership is, of course, resistant. They're donor-oriented, oriented towards the main centers of power, but popular opinion can't be overlooked forever. And I think there are opportunities now for moving towards significant changes in US policy. And even a threat of change would have a big impact on Israel. It's important to recognize that back in the 1970s, Israel did have a fateful decision to make. This was the Labor Party. They had to decide whether to accept political, diplomatic settlement, which was available, granting essentially everything they claim they want. UN resolutions calling for two states, the right of each state to exist in peace and security on the international border. Israel had to decide, do we want a political settlement or do we want to expand? They chose to expand. They were backed by the United States, which vetoed the resolutions and gave them support in their expansionist projects. Well, that has a corollary. If you decide to choose expansion over diplomacy and security, you're going to become a pariah state over time. There'll be moral degeneration internally. Violence and repression will have its consequences internationally, and they will be more reliant on the United States for survival. Give up your efforts to integrate with the local population, world, more or less liberal opinion. That's what's going to happen. So now Israel's basically got a choice. It if it is responsive to, has to be responsive to U.S. policy. It's given away all the other cards. If U.S. policy changes, Israel can either accommodate to it or become a small militaristic reactionary state allied with other brutal ultra-reactionary states in the region. It's basically what the Abraham Accords are, an alliance among the most reactionary, repressive states of the region. If that's what Israel chooses as its future, that's one possibility, but it will isolate itself from Western society and Western opinion. US policy shifts, I think Israel will accommodate to it, and it can shift. It's a possibility. For the first time, this is a real, live possibility.
Many thanks, Professor Chomsky. I actually want to rebound on the Abraham Accords and maybe ask you, Imad. We talk about the US part in what's happening in Palestine, but what about the Arab world in terms of the governments, not the people? And what about the Abraham Accords? In your opinion, Imad, are they a game changer or what are they for Palestine?
First, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Professor Chomsky. I go next.
Okay.
Well, there's several things to notice about the Abraham Accords. The one is, you mentioned governments. Yes, it's governments. In the Arab world, governments have nothing to do with people. These are tyrannical dictatorships. They hold down the population by force. The Egyptian dictatorship, maybe the worst in Egypt's history, is simply a violent, brutal dictatorship, has maybe at least 60,000 people in jail, harsh repression. The family dictatorships of the Gulf are some of the most repressive governments in the world. The Abraham Accords brought together this group of highly repressive dictatorial states along with Israel. In effect, it took tacit arrangements which had already existed and raised them to the level of a formal agreement. Didn't basically change very much, just formalized the agreement. We should notice, incidentally, that it includes Morocco. That's not insignificant. If you look at the governments, the states brought together in the Abraham Accords, they are basically the states that have, aside from Israel, which has the muscle, the others have the main natural resources of the region. Same is true of Morocco. Morocco doesn't have oil, but it has phosphates. Basically has a near monopoly of phosphates in the world. Phosphates are irreplaceable. They're critical for agricultural production. Morocco conquered the Western Sahara, much the way Israel conquered Palestine, is holding it illegally, violation of international law, but with U.S. support, much like Israel-Palestine. Trump made it explicit. That's another step towards expanding the phosphate monopoly. All of these things are interrelated. The Abraham Accords bring together the most repressive, violent states in the region, along with the natural resources of the region, all under the U.S. aegis. Well, that's the Abraham Accords. It's kind of interesting that they're celebrated by liberal opinion almost everywhere. If you look at what they actually are, that's a little bit ironic, but put that aside. Anyway, that's their nature. For Trump and the Republicans and many of the Democrats, it's part of a broader geopolitical vision, namely bring together the world's most reactionary, brutal states as a base for U.S. power over the world. That's in the Middle East, it's essentially the Abraham Accords. In the Western Hemisphere, it's Bolsonaro's Brazil, Duque's Colombia, pretty similar. Moving to the East, Modi's India, natural member, crushing Muslim rights, hundreds of millions of people, crushing Kashmir, very natural, and destroying Indian secular democracy. That's natural candidate. Europe, it's places like Orban's Hungary, destroying the democratic system. So this entire system, forged together under Washington's aegis, would be a global base for the most extreme reactionary version of U.S. power, the Trump Republican version. Well, that's all been taking shape. The Abraham Accords are part of this.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I'd like you, Imad, to react, and then I'll have a final question for you both. So, Imad, what's your opinion on what Noam said?
I agree with the Professor Chomsky. I think this Abraham Accords, they are like a new normalization between some Arab regimes and Israel. But the reality, it was a long-term alliance between the authoritarian regime and the settler colonialism of Palestine. And this is very clear. It's not a conspiracy anymore, especially after the Arab Spring in 2011, when Israel allied directly with the Arab authoritarian regimes. And like Professor Chomsky said, we have an exchange. Palestine, all of Palestine is for Israel, and Western Sahara for Morocco. And Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, they would be allied with Israel against Iran. But in fact, this is not normalization because in fact, this is alliance. And Israel is uncovering this alliance. It exists since the 70s, and with the United Arab Emirates since the first decade of the 2000s. So it's nothing new as an alliance between dictatorships, authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, and the settler colonialism of Palestine. And I don't call it a peace process because, for example, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, they were never in war with Israel. But for example, if we talk about Jordan or the Palestinian Authority or Egypt, yes, it does work to call it a peace process between them and Israel because there was a war between these countries.
Thank you, Imad. So my final question is about, we talked about the Arab world, we talked about the US. I want to talk about public opinion. Noam mentioned it. I mean, the last Gaza war saw the biggest demonstrations throughout the world in support of Palestine. We also saw celebrities, very high-profile people that never talked about Palestine before, that at least on social media started to talk about Palestine. So I'll start with you, Professor Chomsky. Do you think public opinion, in a way, could sway the balance in favor of a just peace for the Palestinians? Is that the future, in a way?
I think there are real opportunities. There has been a long-term shift in public opinion of the kind I described. It's now reaching a point exactly like what you mentioned, open, overt support for Palestinian rights, including celebrities, demonstrations, and so on. It's quite striking during the US demonstrations, during the latest crimes, that you didn't have the usual counter demonstrations. They just weren't there. People don't want to be seen. It doesn't mean that the forces disappear. They're working hard to try to prevent this, but they can't really appear in public. Public's turning against them. Well, with dedicated, committed, sensible tactics aimed at reaching results, not just feeling good about something, yes, things could happen. It's going to take hard, serious work and careful thinking about appropriate tactics, because the forces that want to maintain the current system of power and repression are dedicated, relentless. They're going to keep working on it. They're not going away. And you have to be able to counter them with serious work on the ground, which can change things. I think there really are opportunities now that didn't exist before.
Many thanks, Noam. Imad, I'll give you the final word, if you want.
I think what changed the public opinion internationally, many factors, but basically I will concentrate on two. I think we as a human being, we respect the victim when the victim resists for its right. And the Palestinians this time, they united and they raised their voice in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the diaspora, inside Israel, to say we are suffering since 73 years of settler colonialism. But also Israel narrative of settler colonialism, it was protected in the media, especially in the Western media. But we had the luck as Palestinians that this Jacob settler from New York, who invaded the home of Palestinians, civilians in Jerusalem, and he wanted to steal their home because God told him this is your home, or his religion told him his home. So this video became viral in the social media, and this really broke the narrative of the Israeli settler colonialism. And now the people are no longer buying the Israeli narrative. I was asked 2 days ago, honestly, for the first time in Germany, somebody asked me if my parents have homes in what is now Israel, and it was stolen from them. I was surprised by this question because we never reached to this level of discussing the settler colonialism of Israel. And my answer was yes. We have a land which is now Israel, and we have this contract from the Ottoman and then by the British mandate. This break through in the Israeli narrative is very important for the public opinion around the world, in my opinion.
Many thanks, Professor Chomsky. Really, thanks a million. Thanks to you as well, obviously, Imad. I'm very glad this conversation happened. So I wish you a very good day, Noam, very good evening, Imad.
And I'm so happy to have Noam Chomsky, and it will be a life memory for me. Thank you so much for accepting for this.
Very pleased to have a chance to talk to you.
Okay.
More.
That's amazing. Bye-bye. Bye. Thanks again.